Last time we were talking about nationalism, imperialism, colonialism, and we talked about some of the goals of the Europeans when they would come into an area, like say Asia or Africa, and really the pattern of how the colonial rule of the Europeans is pretty similar, even though it's in different places around the world. As we mentioned last time, one of them was actually conversion, evangelism, if you will. Many of these places, people were not following Christianity. They were following other religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, animism, local religion, and so that would be part of it. In fact, there was a kind of model of usually followed this pattern. I call it sometimes the 3 M's: merchants, missionaries, then the military. The merchants would be usually the first ones to make contact because there was money to be made, trade of some kind. Once they made contact, then the word gets out, hey, you can get there, here's what it's like, here are the people there. And usually very shortly thereafter, missionaries will go. Once the missionaries go, and some people begin to settle with the mission, then sometimes a conflict would take place where there would be a threat made to some of the people, and that's when the military would come to protect, let's say, the British residents, British people in a certain area. So that pattern is there. I don't think somebody sat down with it and made that the plan, but that you can see it happening quite often in different parts of the world. Okay. So conversion was definitely part of it. Creating institutions. These are institutions of that I suppose many of us take for granted, that there would be a post office, a way to communicate that way. Of course, they were building telegraphs as well, right? Communications. Medical care, hospitals, clinics, doctors, schools, education, government, a building for the government, and different laws and regulations, for traffic and trade and all those kinds of things. Some of these places did not have that, places where they came. So the Europeans would construct roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, churches, government buildings, train tracks, so forth. So, and then when we ended last time, we said once established, the Europeans used 2 basic models to control or influence or govern. One was a direct and the other indirect. And the name, I think, pretty much says it all. Direct would be the Europeans, whether it's the British or the French or whoever, would directly, say, have a British governor, a British ruler of the area, and then government agencies under that leader to sort of carry out the construction of these things, the governing, judicial system. And then, of course, in some cases where there was a more active local government, they would basically just keep that local government in place, but the local government would have certain restrictions where they'd have to come to the Europeans for permission to do certain things. Okay? That's the indirect rule. There were colonial advisors who would say, you can't really do that. But the rest, they'd have more freedom. And of course, if things get out of hand, we could always go to the direct rule. So this is the kind of thing that you see. And we're not going to go through this, especially in this class, but you see that is the pattern. We also see a kind of pattern whereby change will come. Eventually, local people will push for change and reform. But it's interesting, this little pyramid that you see on the screen, again, is a stylized representation of many of these colonial societies. And by this, I'm talking about local people. I'm not talking about, like, say, the British. This would be the local people. So what do we see? We see that the local people who tended to have the most power and the most influence were the ones that had the most connection to the colonial rule. And the ones who are going to have the most connection to them are the ones who can speak their language well. Because, let's say, the British or the French or whoever, they need someone who understands the local customs, the local people, but also understands the European desires and language. So that we can have a meeting, call these guys in, local people in. The colonial rulers say, okay, we need to make sure this and this and this happens and this doesn't happen. And those people can then go and translate that into the local language. And therefore they get a lot of power. Those local people who can, say, speak English well and who are well connected with the British are the ones who have the most influence in their society, even though they're not British, but they have the connections. All right? In fact, it's often those, and you notice they're very small up on top of the pyramid there. In other words, it's a small number of people. They're also the ones that would often be sent, say, to England to go to the university. They'd go to England to the university, say to Oxford or Cambridge or someplace like that, because it's very prestigious. It would also ensure that they made a lot of connections with British people who are important, right? So that when they come back home, let's say to India, that they would have connections back in England, they would have connections at home, they would be Oxford trained, you know. They'd be very much enculturated into the British system, but of course they grew up in India, so they know that system too. They know that language. And so these are the people that usually are the ones who have the most influence. They're going to be the ones actually that push for the most changes in a measured way. And so by the time you see in the 19th century, there would be various councils, and again I'm speaking generalities, but councils or organizations that would, of local people, native people, who would be pushing for some changes. And they're going to push from the changes mostly through, I guess it's the red dot up here, the red point of the pyramid. It's a small number. Now, just below that, you see in the yellow, local people with more power. And they could have different titles. These might be religious leaders, monks, something like that. They might be wealthy sort of merchants or professionals that have been trained. Or maybe in a village, it might be somehow the main village, the main ruler of the village. Could go by different names, a magistrate or a governor, you know, a mayor or something like that. So, or even a kind of a tribal name, you know. So in other words, you'd have some kind of local level people. These are people of influence. They probably don't know English or know it very well, but they have local power. So you have these English-speaking elites that are sort of the go-betweens between, the British and the local leaders, and that gives them a lot of influence. And then, of course, as always, most of the people are those people at the bottom, right? Most of the people are the people at the bottom. People are just doing their jobs, right? Peasants, we might call them peasants, farmers, laborers. They have different workers. They have different names. But basically, these are people just trying to get by, right? They're just trying to feed their families. They're trying to live their life. They don't have a lot of influence. And in fact, I think a lot of times they find that it doesn't really matter who's in charge because they're all going to sort of take advantage of me, whether it's the British or the locals or whoever. I just have to try to find a way to make it the best I can in this system. All right, and that's the great majority of the people, probably 80%. You know, probably this pyramid doesn't do it justice. It's probably even more people than that are at kind of the bottom. All right. Well, we find this same kind of thing happening, and it's repeated. You can look, for example, say in India. India is a prime example because it was one of the premier colony of the British. In fact, the British called India the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. That's the way they described it. In other words, it was the most important of all of the British Empire. Why? Well, it had a huge population. It had a big market for British goods. It also had a large workforce that could make things for Britain. It had a lot of resources. And because of that, India had a kind of special status in the British Empire and was often described as the most important, or as they would say, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. So we see it's these wealthy natives and wealthy educated natives who would often be at the very top. And like I said, they would often be trained for the bureaucracy, be trained for the colonial governmental posts, which would involve either being trained locally at a university, or, of course, if you had the pull and the money, you would go off to Europe to be trained. Like, say, if it was a British Empire, British colony, maybe to Oxford or to Cambridge or to someplace like that. Then when you came back to India, you'd been trained in England, right? So you know the English ways, you know the English language. You have connections that you have made. All right? It's still somewhat that today, I suppose, and it's sort of a different route. I mean, people say from China or other countries, some of them really want to come, say, to the United States to go to college. Why? Because they'll really learn English and they will make connections. And the idea is when they get back home, if they have a degree from almost any university in the United States, most of the people at home would consider that to be better than having almost any degree from a home institution. Okay? And it's somewhat like that today. People in the United States tend to think if they go to school in England, it's somehow better than if they go to school here. Well, anyway. So part of it's status and that sort of thing. But when these people are trained for the bureaucracy, then they're the ones who will eventually, they're the ones who will eventually take control, right? So like I said, whether it's Oxford, Cambridge, if they're going to France, they go to the Sorbonne, all right, in Paris, someplace like that. Now, the common people, you know, your regular folks, workers, there's no way their child's ever going to go study in England, let's say, or France. They simply don't have the money for that. They also don't have probably the language skills. They don't have the resources to train their children, educate their children so that they could make it, even if they could possibly get there, linguistically and so forth, financially. So what are they going to do? Well, many of them go uneducated altogether. They have a rudimentary education at home, whatever their parents know. If their parents know how to read, they might teach them how to read, maybe teach them some math. You know, there aren't a lot of, say here in the United States, it's obviously universally across the United States, you have public schools, and basically everybody goes to school. In fact, in the United States, if you don't go to school, you could get in trouble, right? Or the parents could get in trouble, fined, or if a child is repeatedly out of school, they could be turned into a truant officer, and I don't know what would happen to them. But in other words, what I'm saying is, it's not only available, it's required to go to school. It was not the case here. There were no schools. There were very few opportunities for them. Just to give you one example, in Vietnam, in 1917, there were only 3,000 towns with a school out of the 23,000 towns in Vietnam. Okay? That's a public school. Even in the history of the United States, in the West, when it comes to education, the sort of European model had been to have tutors. Wealthy people would hire a person to come to their home, or maybe a group of family, a group of wealthy families would hire a tutor and they'd send their kids to one of the houses and they would start their own kind of school there and be trained privately. Public schools were not as common at first. And in the United States, in the South, in the southern part of the United States, mostly that's the way education was done. You'd have a tutor or a teacher, and whatever you want to call it, who would be hired by a family or maybe 2 or 3 families, and they would teach. In the northern part of the United States, usually it was left to a community. A community would decide, we need a school. So the town, whatever the name of the town is, Smithville, let's call it that. I don't know why. There's probably plenty of Smithvilles out there. We'll say, well, we need to have a school. And so they would construct a building or find a place for it to meet, and they would hire a teacher. The teacher would then answer to the local mayor or whoever is in charge of the thing. And it had all kinds of rules for teachers, how they were supposed to live and how they were supposed to conduct themselves, and they could be fired at any time. And typically they'd have it in one room, and they'd have several different ages in one room, and they would be asked to teach that way. Okay, so, but of course the model we have today has evolved from a lot of that. So really, for a lot of children who were not wealthy, poorer, their only opportunity for education is going to come often from a church-related school, a mission school. So somebody would start a mission in an area. 2 things would often be started by missions. One would be a school. School is very common. That was one of the first things that they would do. Why? Well, it's a great way to reach people, right? You get their kids there, you offer free education to local people, and they say, well, my child, I don't have the education, I don't have the time to train my team, and I don't have the money to send them somewhere, but here they're going to do it for free. So I'll send my child there. Not only that, but my child will not only be learning my language, but they'll also be learning the language of the missionary, right? So they maybe learn English or whatever as well. And it's free. Basically it's all free. And so for the mission, this is a way to meet the children, a way to influence the children, a way to influence the families. So it's a mutual agreement. And so mission schools is what I'll call them, would be the only chance for many poorer families, poor children to receive education. And from that, then, of course, if somebody did well, they might make connections, be able to do things, and have a whole different life than perhaps their parents had or have at the time. Okay? So this is kind of how this works. So, many people talk about only something that's negative that comes out of colonialism. And certainly there's plenty of negative stuff you could talk about. But I think if you're honest, you can see that there were some benefits as well. Better medical care, better education, that sort of thing. But it came at a cost. So, but it's not, I don't think it's all one way. I don't think it's all terrible. And a lot of times, a lot of textbooks and other things, they sort of say it's all bad. I don't see it as being all bad. There certainly was bad stuff associated with it. Sometimes kind of racism and controlling of the Europeans. But it also did provide some benefits for the people as well. Well, let's take a look at example. This example will be Britain in India, right? Britain in India. Britain, by far the largest colonial power in the world, will get involved in India. They control India, and they've controlled it. If you remember, we talked about the 7 Years' War. This is when the British take it over and basically push the French out, and they control it that way. But you'll see that once they have control of India, they're not just sort of satisfied with that. They want to control access to India. They want to control other areas. So, for example, they begin to move into Burma. Burma, which is to the north and east of India. Why? Because they wanted to control trade routes into China, from China to India. So a lot of things we'll see that sort of like they'll get one colony, then they'll expand around that colony to protect or control access. I don't know, have you ever played a game called Risk? You ever heard of that game? I don't know if anybody plays it anymore. Very low tech and, but it's a map of the world, right? And basically he's trying to take over the world. I mean, in a nutshell, that's what the whole thing's about. So you have, you build up military and that sort of thing, little pieces. You put them on the board, and then you roll dice and stuff, and you see you can take new territories, right? So a lot of times in that game, if you play it, some places maybe you're not that interested in. You're only interested in them because they are access to something else that you really control, right? Anyway, if you play the game, you understand. Otherwise, you don't. But, I mean, it's the same kind of thing here with the colonial powers. They want to control access to India because they don't want anything to happen in India, and they want to make sure the trade route keeps flowing from India to Britain, from China to India, and so forth, to keep everything going. Now, this also then gets the British involved in Afghanistan. Why? Why Afghanistan? Because Afghanistan sort of borders the Southern Territory, which at that time the Russian Empire was moving southward. And they didn't want the Russians to get too close to India. They didn't want the Russians getting a port on the warm water of the Indian Ocean or somewhere down in that area. And so basically Afghanistan was kind of for a block, right? Blocking the Russians to getting too close to India. By the way, it didn't go that well for the British in Afghanistan. It hasn't gone that well for anybody who moved into Afghanistan. The British controlled it for a while, but were eventually, when they decided to leave, this is when all the local people, began to really fight them then and killed a lot of them as they were leaving. You know, the Russians tried to take over Afghanistan in the 1980s, late 70s and 80s. That did not end well for the Russians. Many people have called Afghanistan the Russian Vietnam because it drained a lot of their resources and they didn't really win. And of course, we are still somewhat involved in Afghanistan. And we have been now for, I don't know, I'm trying to think how many years. 15 years? I mean, it's the longest sort of war. I don't know officially if it's over or not, but we still have troops there. And that hasn't gone all that well either. We'll see. But anyway, this is the way it works, though. But sort of to block things that they do this. So, as I've been talking about, most people would not mention any benefits of European colonization. So I'm going to go out on a limb and talk about a few things. It's easy to mention the bad things. Control by outsiders, many of them exhibiting racism or so forth. But there are some benefits, and I've already been talking about those, right? So let me just list them out. I think stability of government. Certainly the governments were very stable. You know, even if a government is not that good, and this might be, you may not agree with me, but I think about it. A government that's stable, but maybe not that good of a government, is better than governments in upheaval. Why? I think more people die when governments are not stable. There's more violence, there's more crime, there's more death. If a government's stable, well, remember what Jesus said. He never said to overthrow the Romans. He never said, he said when it came to paying your taxes to somebody like Nero or even Tiberius, he said, give to them what is theirs. Pay your taxes. He never advocated sort of a revolution and overthrowing the government. And the Roman government was pretty severe, right? It was very severe. Autocratic, definitely. It was no democracy at all. It didn't even pretend to be. Anyway, so I think a stable government, even if it's a harsh government, is better than no government, and I think it's better than like a lot of upheaval, warfare, and so forth. A lot of people die. I think there is increased education level, maybe through mission schools and other things like that. Let me just mention a couple of practices. For example, the British in India tried to end, well, I guess they did end, although maybe it was carried on secretly or something, but officially it was against the law. At things that I think we would all agree are inhumane. One of them had to involve women in India. Women in India were not really allowed at this time to really have sort of control of their lives, to have an income, that sort of thing. So, for example, let's say a woman's married to somebody, maybe they have 3 or 4 children, the husband dies. You might assume that the widow gets what her husband leaves. You would assume wrong. The widow did not get what the husband left. It would go to the sons. Her sons would get it. Sometimes the eldest son, sometimes it would be divided between sons. And then it would be up to the son to decide how the mother would be cared for. Some sons were better at that than others. All right? And if they were widowed without any property or anything, it was also not really allowed in their customs for a woman to remarry, for a widow to remarry. That was considered wrong. So you'd have a woman that didn't have any resources, couldn't really get the resources, and couldn't marry anybody else that might help her. So she's really stuck in that situation. In fact, in India, there was the custom that was strongly encouraged that widows would not continue their life after their husbands died. It was their custom to, instead of burying people, they would build a funeral pyre, sort of like a big bonfire kind of thing. They'd put the body on top of it and light it, and it would burn up the body. What the widow was expected to do was to jump onto the fire with her husband. Now, sometimes the widow in her grief forgot to do that, and other people would remind her by throwing her on there. Okay? This is a practice that was called sati. Sati. The British end that practice. They say that's illegal. You can't do that anymore. And they also changed the law so that widows could remarry. It wouldn't be against the law or whatever. Now, still, there was a lot of cultural pressure for this. But this is an inhumane practice which the British tried to end, is what I'm trying to say. And I think we'd all agree that was a good thing. All right? Okay. The other thing that also happened in India that was common that the British put an end to, or certainly tried to put an end to, were the Thuga. The Thuga was sort of a group, almost like a gang, and they commonly attacked people who were traveling. You know, people who are traveling usually are carrying extra money or extra possessions, right? Because they're going to be gone for a week or two or whatever. They're going to have to buy things along the way. Travelers are vulnerable anywhere. They don't know their way. They don't know all the places. They don't know all the routes. They don't know, where they can go. They don't know all the resources. They're carrying extra money with them or possessions. They're easy targets. In fact, here in Florida, I've read, a lot of tourist travelers are targeted by people. And they're pretty easy to spot, right? Especially around here. We're not far from Orlando. I don't know how many tourists come there a year, right? Millions maybe, certainly thousands upon thousands, but probably millions come. And what do? Well, they're pretty easy to spot. Here's somebody from Germany, here's somebody from a different country or whatever. They rent a car. If they got a rental car, it's an obvious thing. These are not people from around here because they got a rental car. And they sometimes will stop them on the road, steal from those tourists. They'll hit the cars in the parking lot when nobody's in them. They'll take their luggage. All kinds of things like that. I'm not going to go through and list them all. You know what I'm talking about. And so this kind of thing was happening in India. And so the British tried to put an end to that. And they ended it in many places. Again, I think most people would say, well, that is a positive thing. They also built a lot of infrastructure, especially the British tended to build maybe more infrastructure than maybe some other countries. So they, and this is an investment of a lot of money, to build a road and a bridge and a railroad and telegraph service and postal systems and hospitals and schools. This, that's investing money in the local economy and the local population, for which there is not an immediately returned income, right? If you build a factory somewhere, you might say, well, the guy that builds the factory, he's going to make product and he's going to make back his money. Right? At least I suppose that would be the assumption. But if somebody builds a bridge and a road, maybe they get some benefit from that. I'm sure they do. But it's really, there might be a way to avoid doing some of that that's pretty expensive. At any rate, everyone benefits, I think, from having the bridge, the road, the trains, the postal service, the telegraph, the hospitals, the schools. The other thing that the British often did was brought their own set of laws. Now, by British thinking, this was a benefit because their laws made sense to them. Maybe they didn't make sense to all the local people. But certainly some of the British laws were thought to be more humane than some of the local laws. For example, limiting punishment of somebody. In some of these areas, if a poor person did something to a rich person, there would be no limits as to what might happen to that person. The British Penal Code would say, no, there are limits. You can't chop the guy's arm off. You can't kill him or something for stealing something from you. So this, again, it's a bit, somebody might say, imposing of laws, but I suppose some people did benefit from some of that. And certainly in health and sanitation, building of sewers or setting up areas somehow to get clean water, wells, pumps, that sort of thing. Hospitals, clinics, people trained as doctors and nurses. these were things that, the British just assumed this should happen, and, this is just what you do. And so they did it, even in the colonies, right? And also, of course, you have more and more British living in the colonies, and they're also using these things as well. Now, this was a cost. It did cost the British something. But, of course, this stuff did not come for free for the locals. The locals then gave up a lot of control, influence. They were now basically being controlled by an outside power. Sometimes the British would make decisions, for example, that would damage local economy, especially in the area of textiles. The British ruled textiles for a long time. They had made things out of wool, then they started making things out of cotton, and they started making finished shirts, pants, whatever, dresses, and they would ship these things around and sell it, and they were turning a big profit on textiles, and it was stylish to wear the European clothing rather than the local clothing because it had a different look and it was more appealing. Another thing that happened in these colonies, especially in British ones like in India, is that there was a kind of relationship that went to the wealthier people who lived out in the countryside. The wealthy people out in the countryside had land. One of the things the British were interested in is that people would pay taxes. This is another cost of the local people. You pay taxes, and those taxes go to the British government. So, for example, if somebody had a piece of property that could not pay the taxes, the British were more than happy to have those goods, those land, transferred to somebody who could pay the taxes. So we see that the wealthy landowner actually begins to gain more and more land. Okay, so it gets concentrated. This is sometimes called the gentry. Now the British hoped that this would help stabilize things because the people who would actually pay their taxes and the people who actually had enough income and wealth to be stable, and if they're getting benefit from the British, they won't want to disrupt that system. So for the British, this was a good system. Probably some of the local small landowners didn't think it was such a good system. Another thing that was a cost to the local people would be that the British did not really invest money in industrialization. Yes, they built infrastructure of government, roads, bridges, but they weren't really interested in building a lot of high-tech, what we, for their time, would be high-tech factories, and installing a lot of things that would make, say, India highly industrialized. That kind of stuff was not funded. Okay? It was better off for India, in the British view, that it was a producer, say, of cotton and other raw materials, and that England was the one who made the manufactured goods and then would turn around and sell it to people in India and elsewhere in the world. So there was not the motivation by the British to actually build up the industrialization of India, and in their other colonies too. So it didn't happen as much. Part of the problem was it was also as risky. You know, let's say, for example, you were very wealthy, as I can see many of you are, and you wanted to invest your money. You know, if you're very wealthy, like you guys are, not me, if you just hang on to your money, you're actually losing money. If you got $1 billion just sitting around, you're actually losing money by just letting it sit around because you don't really make any money. You could potentially make a lot of money. As they say, it takes money to make money. And if you got a lot of money, you need to be using that money to make more money. Otherwise, in essence, you're losing money because you'll lose some to taxes every year, and It's just the potential of it is lost. So, let's say you're going to invest money to build a factory, to build something, and then you might turn a profit, right? If you did that, say back in England, you would know most of the risks. You would know the situation. You would be close to the situation to keep an eye on it, right? The factory and whatever else is going on, the politics of it. But if you invested the same amount of money, or an equivalent large amount of money, say in India, it gets much more complicated, right? Because you can't be both in England and India at the same time. Communication isn't as good, and there's more risk. What if something happens politically? You might lose your entire investment. And this does happen. This has happened. So you invest, billions of dollars, and then they say, hey, we're taking over your factory, we're taking over this company. It's now part of our government. So it's much more risky. So for the investor, there's not a lot of local capital to do it, and outside capital sometimes doesn't want to take the risk. Foreign investment is always riskier for many reasons than domestic. There was little local capital to do it, and therefore little advantage for the British investor to do it because of high risk. And how much are you really going to make on this high risk? So if I can take $1 million and invest it here, and I turn, even if I get a 10% profit on that, if I take it over to a foreign country and invest it, can I make 10%? If I can, it's a much higher risk. I may not be able to do it as long. It may not last. So I decide, you know what? I'll just do it here. I'll do it somewhere else, somewhere that's closer. This has happened to people even as recently, let's say, with Puerto Rico. A lot of people started to move to Puerto Rico because they had no taxes. They paid no federal tax. I was reading about this, and so some people actually moved their company there or whatever. That they could have built it, in the mainland part of the United States, but they would go to Puerto Rico, and we don't have to pay any of these, a lot of these taxes, and so we're going to go there and do it because it'll be good. But of course, in the end, the infrastructure wasn't as good in Puerto Rico, and there was a lot of internal corruption. Of course, the hurricanes and other things. In other words, it made it much more risky for them, and for some of them, it hasn't worked that well, right? And that's a much more local kind of thing, right? It's not even saying like we're going to take it to Guatemala or somewhere further afield, right? Well, anyway, so this is the idea that that often brings a disadvantage to the local people because it's a higher risk. So what happens then? Well, this kind of thing that I'm talking about, this sort of colonialism, happens around the world. And we're primarily talking about Europeans doing this. We've talked about India. But the same kind of things happen in Africa, Southeast Asia, and so forth. And then eventually what will happen is there will be a call for change. At least there has been a call for change, right? And typically the people doing this are the educated natives. When we talked about what happened in South America, I remember that we talked about what happened in South America, after the time of Napoleon, where they sort of knock out the Spanish and the Portuguese from the picture. And then there's this independence movement. The people that led that independence movement were the people of European descent, many of which who went and were educated, say in Spain. They come back home and they lead changes, push for changes. Same thing happens in India. Same kind of thing happens elsewhere in the world. Educated native elites begin to demand more and more local rule, more and more sort of democratic practices. They are influenced not only by their Western education, their European education, but also the growing nationalism. People in India want to be in India, right? Be for India. make India great again, or whatever. They had a hat. I don't know. No, maybe not. But you know, they wanted to push rule of India by people from India rather than British. We can understand that, I think. But Romanticism also, sort of like being opposed to the new ways. Let's go back to local rule. And all of these things happen, which begins to lead then to resistance of the Europeans. So things begin to move towards democracy, beginning to move towards more local rule. But still, you got to remember, the local rule is not really turning it over to like the peasants. This is turning it over to the local people who are the wealthiest and the most educated and the ones that were the most connected already. Often. All right, let's move to a different topic now, which is related. And we mentioned Hegel before, right? We mentioned Hegel when we talked about Marxism. So I thought maybe we should at least have a brief introduction to who Hegel is and what his ideas are, because they really did make an impact. Hegel, I think you might call him a philosopher. I suppose other people might call him other things, you know. But he's primarily a sort of philosopher of history, philosopher of ideas. As Hegel looked at the world, he saw that there was overarching forces, or he believed there was an overarching force that controlled the world, the history of the world. He saw the history of the world much as a line, linear. Now within that line, I've sometimes described it kind of like a loop. There would be a loop and then it would kind of move forward, right? Like that. If that makes any sense. So he says that we start here, we end over there, and to get to there we kind of loop our way in that direction. How do we make that loop? We make that loop because in our society we have things the way they are, we have things the way things are set up and the way they run. He calls that the thesis. That's sort of the way things operate. There will arise people who don't like the way that is and they want to change it. And that'll be called the antithesis or the antithesis. The thesis and the antithesis will collide. They will battle. And then that will lead to conflict. And then ultimately something new will emerge, and that's going to be called the synthesis. By the way, the synthesis then becomes the new thesis, to which arises a new antithesis, to which brings more conflict, to which brings a new synthesis, and it just keeps going, and it's heading in a direction. This is all driven, ultimately, Hegel would say, by God, but he calls it the dialectic. The dialectic is a God-established system for the way in which the world works. This is really what Hegel believed. That God is using this force called the dialectic to sort of drive history in a direction or in the route that he wants it to go, or that it should go. And along the way, there will rise certain individuals who are of great importance to this dialectic and to this conflict, which Hegel called them world historic individuals. World historic individuals. The world historic individuals then would be people like Napoleon, I suppose, people like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, names that you would recognize from history who conquered land, who did big things and who change things. These world historic individuals, Hegel, I think, would argue, didn't really know that they were sort of part of this master plan, although maybe they sort of sensed of destiny, or that, that they couldn't fail, or this was going to work, or whatever. But they were a part of that plan. So this is the way he looked at history. He looked at history, he went back through history, and he said, well, okay, you can see history is moving from point A ultimately to point B, but along the way, the thing that really ends up, the key to understanding him, the thing that really ends up driving history forward is conflict, and for him the conflict ends up being war. War of different kinds. Fighting. Military conflict. All right, so that's Hegel's ideas. And Hegel's ideas became very popular. In fact, they were so popular that at universities of this time, of the 19th century, students had clubs called Hegelian clubs or Hegelian societies. And they would get together and discuss this sort of thing and debate it, and was this, or this is that. And also, for example, it's very popular, since he's a Prussian, he's German. In Germany, that had sort of been left, as like I told you before, Germany had kind of been left out of advancement and having colonies and everything because it wasn't unified. And now that it's unified under the Prussians, many people see that as the outgrowth of this Hegelian idea and of the dialectic. That basically what they're going to say is, Germany's time has come. Germany's time has come now. The dialectic is moving things forward. And, our time will to rise to power. We'll have a world historic individual or whatever and make this happen. So here, I want you to know I slaved over a hot computer for many, many hours to create an elaborate graphic that will burn this Hegelian thought into your retina and onto your cerebral cortex, or wherever you store it, your flash drive of your brain. Look at that, a circle. Just a circle? No, that's the thesis. What happens then, you ask? A line. Another circle? Is that another circle? No. The antithesis. What happens then? A line. And what comes after that? A circle? Not just a circle. The synthesis. And how does that happen? Conflict. But then the synthesis becomes another circle? No, the thesis. To which arises another line, another circle, another antithesis. So you see how that works? To which will then rise more new conflict, to which then will rise a new synthesis, which will then become a new thesis, to which then will rise a new antithesis, will then rise to another conflict, and on and on and on until A gets to B. That's, in a nutshell, Hegel's thought. And for him, conflict was war. Fighting between Napoleon and the Russians, fighting between Alexander and the Persians, or whatever, okay? So there is your graphic of the dialectic. I know. You're welcome. You're welcome. All right, well, all right. Take it away now. Now enter our buddy Karl Marx. We talked about him before, but I wanted really to come back and make it clear how Karl Marx takes the ideas of Hegel and changes it somewhat. He keeps the outline. He's basically, you might say, plagiarizing the outline of Hegel, but he's changing a few key items. One of those is that Marxism is atheistic. Karl Marx did not believe God was in the picture at all. All right, so he's going to remove that. That was the basics of Hegel, is that all this is being driven by God. Well, Karl Marx is going to flip Hegel sort of over on his head, or whatever you want to call it, take the idea and sort of take it a different way. Karl Marx came from a middle-class Jewish family. He was not poor. He lived in Germany. He lived in a city called Trier, which had been an old Roman city. He had joined a young Hegelian society when he was at the university. He knew all about Hegel, these ideas I was just telling you about. Much more detailed than I just gave it to you, but he knew all these ideas. He had studied and he became, I guess, what we might call a radical journalist. He basically wasn't really making money, right? Most radical journalists don't make a lot of money. At least they didn't used to. I don't know, now with the internet, maybe they find a way to make you click on something so that you watch something and they get a penny every time you do that or something. I don't know how it works. Anyway, he begins pushing. For him, the dialectic is there. God is not there. For him, conflict is there. But instead of warfare, for him, the conflict is revolution. Revolution. Revolution is what's going to move forward the dialectic, going to move things from A to B. And for him, when you get to B, you are at a utopia. There is no heaven because there is no God. Heaven is the utopia that will be created on earth when all of the revolutions take place and all of the changes of the dialectic have moved forward. And we all live in peace and harmony, sharing alike. Each one according to his ability, each one according to his need. That was a nice phrase they had, a little slogan. So, you were good at doing something, you're going to do that. That's your ability. You're good at neurosurgery. Another guy's good at auto mechanics. Why should we value one more than the other? They're all needed for society. So, the neurosurgeon does neurosurgery. The auto mechanic does auto mechanics. And, neither one gets paid. They don't need to be paid. We don't need money. Why do we need money? Because no one will charge anything for anything. Each will take according to his need. You need a hamburger, you get the hamburger. You don't pay for the hamburger. The guy who makes the hamburgers, he's good at making the hamburgers. That's what he provides, right? His ability to cook hamburgers or whatever else that you're going to eat. And you're the auto mechanic and you fix the cars, and then the neurosurgeon needs the car to get to the place to do the surgery. We just all work together. We need to build a hospital. Guys know how to build things. They just come and build it. Well, he didn't get down to a lot of specifics of how some of this stuff would work, but the basic idea was everybody would do what they were able to do, each according to their ability, and everyone would just take what it was they needed. Everybody needs some food. Everybody needs a place to sleep. But you don't need a mansion. You don't need gourmet food. Okay? So, and a part of your skepticism, which I can sense, is because you have been ingrained with a system where you believe that people should be paid, and you believe that things cost money, and you believe that there should be a price set on things. You're skeptical, you're cynical. So what do we have to do? We have to re-educate you. Ultimately, this is the part they don't talk about a lot. There has to be a re-education of the people so that they can realize this new system. And of course, during that re-education system, well, yes, we're going to have somebody really in charge who's going to make sure that re-education takes place. kind of dictatorship of the proletariat to carry out the re-education. Wow. That's unusual. Nobody ever calls me. Somebody from Tampa. I don't really know anybody in Tampa. Well, anyway, that's what it is, and so that's what has to happen. You have to have a re-education, right? Yeah. All right, we're getting ahead of ourselves. But Karl Marx takes these ideas, along with his buddy. Here's his buddy. I know you guys like his beard, right? You like both these guys' beards. Oh, look at Karl's beard. Now that's a classic beard, isn't it? Like I said, by the end of the semester, any one of you can grow a Karl Marx-like beard. But I can come up and yank on it. It's real. Got to measure it. Well, then there'll be some extra credit for you. Or maybe an Engels beard. Okay. You say, well, I can't do a Karl Marx beard. I can do an Engels beard. You guys like beards now. I don't know. People say that they grow a beard. You don't really grow a beard. You just stop shaving. It's not active. There's nothing active about producing a beard. It's passive. You're not growing anything. You're just stop shaving. Personally, I don't really think it's an accomplishment to not shave every day. But somehow we've made it into that. Okay, well, never mind. There's my little beard commentary. Grow all the beards you want. By the way, your beard's always growing whether you shave it or not. We'll just leave it at that. Well, his buddy was named Friedrich Engels. He was the son of a very wealthy industrialist, and this was a good thing for Karl Marx because Karl Marx never really had a job. I mean, he didn't really have an income. But, good thing for him, Friedrich Engels' father had an income, had quite a bit of money, and the two of them basically kind of lived off of Engels' money, or his father's money. Okay, that happens. And they end up together writing a little document called the Communist Manifesto. It's not really very long. You could read it, I don't know, even if you're a slow reader, you could read it in a half an hour, I think. It's not very long, certainly an hour. It's pretty long. It's more like a pamphlet than it is a book. But in it, it spells out their ideas. The Communist Manifesto was timed to come out. I mean, it came out. It's no accident it came out in 1848. Because as you remember, we said in 1848 was a year of upheaval in Europe. Upheaval, I can say it, there we go, in Europe. And so when Engels and Marx see this upheaval, they said now is the time for us to write down our ideas and get them out there. Maybe we can gain some support, some traction. We can influence some people to join in to our ideas here. Well, if you want a fuller description, and I know you do, of Karl Marx's ideas, you would want to read his much longer work entitled Das Kapital, published in 1867. And this is a much heftier work that sort of goes into the theory and practice of it quite a bit more. Here's a nice statue of Karl Marx. It's just really his head, though. On a post. I don't know. Is that a way to honor somebody? Put their head on a post? I don't know if it's. I guess it does. Makes me think that maybe he lost his head and they stuck it on the post, but no, that's the way it's supposed to be. He also brings about what's called the First International. What is the First International, you ask? Well, it's basically a conference. We might call it a meeting. Karl Marx's basic idea was this: everything depends on your class, what class you are in. Are you a worker Are you the bourgeois? You know, everything is based upon that. And what he saw, at least what he believed, and what he wanted to happen, is that workers in different countries, he claimed, had far more in common with each other than they did with the wealthier people in their country. So let's say a German worker, factory worker or whatever, had much more in common with a British factory worker than he did with the guy who owned the factory in Germany, or that the British worker had with the guy who owned the factory in England or France. And so what he believed is he wanted to get these people together in what he called the First International. The idea here is that there would be no countries eventually, and even there would be no classes. And this is the classless state. If we're moving from A to B, that's B. That's our utopia. There are no classes, and everyone is just all in harmony, right? But to get there, of course, there's going to be a lot of conflict. There'll be a lot of revolution, a lot of re-education. So he wanted the workers of, say, Germany and England and France and everywhere to recognize that they are really one group and that they really should be united together. And so that means you got to break down government or allegiance to say, well, I'm a German, so I'm going to side with Germany, or I'm British, I'm going to side with Britain, or whatever. You need to not side with Britain or England or France. You want to side with the workers. So the First International in 1867 had the slogan that comes to sort of characterize what he's saying, and I think if you understand it, it helps. Workers of the world, unite. And the statement goes on to say, you have nothing to lose but your chains. The workers are chained up. They're enslaved by capitalism. And so if we can overthrow capitalism, we can remove the chains, and the workers unite together and lead this glorious revolution, and then we will have eventually this nice utopia. Okay? Yeah?
So doesn't that kind of go against nationalism then?
It does. It's the extreme opposite of nationalism. It's classism, or I don't know, nobody calls it that, but I mean it's seeing yourself in a class and not in a nation. Imagine there's no countries. It's easy if you try. Right? Imagine there's no heaven. Right? So, that song Imagine that I took you through earlier, I think is a good, if you listen to the lyrics and you think about it in this way, it really is a kind of anthem for Marxism. And the idea is you get rid of the countries, then there will be no war, there'll be no eventually they'll have this utopia where the world will just be one. It'll be one world with no countries. Well, there's people that kind of want to promote that today, sort of a globalism and internationalism. There are no countries. We should get rid of countries and just all be one big world. Okay. Well, this is sort of where it comes from, is what I'm saying. Now, another thing that Karl Marx will say that I think you should hear is that religion is bad. He's an atheist, but not only is he an atheist, he believes that religion is bad. I mean, really any religion, but of course in Europe it's primarily Christianity. By the way, he grew up, he was born Jewish, but his father converted to Christianity. Why? According to Karl Marx, because his father wanted to do more business. And if he was a Christian, he could get more business in Europe than if he was a Jew. So he converted to Christianity. Well, I don't know, you'll have to check that out for yourself, but that's what he said. But at any rate, he believed that all religion was a drug, an addictive drug. He called it the opium of the masses. You see these two guys here? They are smoking opium. Yes, and they won't answer their phone either. Why? Well, because when you're smoking opium, all you really care about is smoking the opium. And when you get done smoking the opium, all you really care about is smoking some more opium. Because the opium numbs you. The opium, just makes you, you don't care. You don't care about what's going on around you. You don't care about the world. All you care about is that you're smoking the opium and what the opium's doing to you, right? You just kind of tune out and just, float or whatever they're doing. I don't know. But look at them. They don't look very ambitious. This is from an opium den, by the way, of which there used to be a lot in China and else parts of the world, where people would smoke opium and they were addicted to opium, which comes from poppy seeds, by the way. It's produced as a narcotic. Well, he will say then that it is the opium of the masses. It numbs you and makes you so you're not interested in the world today, what's going on around you. Well, what does religion say? For example, Christianity. Somebody does something wrong to you, what does Christianity say? Turn the other cheek. Should I try to get revenge? No. God will take care of it all in the end. If I have injustice in this world, do I try to change that? Don't worry about it. Why? Because someday God will take care of all of that. Someday you'll get your reward. It's the pie, he called it the pie in the sky by and by. Someday everything will be great. You'll be in heaven and everything will be fine. God will bring justice. You shouldn't do anything. He's saying that is an opium that the guys who run things want you to believe so you won't do anything. He also believed that what we would probably call profit was not profit, but is what was stolen from the workers. So let's say somebody makes a chair. It takes the wood to make the chair. Let's say it's a wooden chair. They make the chair, right? They pay so much for the wood. They cut down a tree. They get some wood. They make it. Then they sell it. And so the guy who's in charge of the chair factory, the difference that he pays between what he pays for the wood and what he pays your salary is what we call profit. So maybe he paid $10 for the wood and he paid you $20 to make the chair, and he sells the chair for $100. He has made $70 in the deal. And Karl Marx is saying he's stealing that from the worker. The worker was the one who added value. He calls it surplus value. He also says that the worker gets alienated from their product because they make something they can't afford to own. So that the bourgeois, the people that own the factories, are controlling the proletariat, and there needs to be a conflict, you see, thesis, antithesis, revolution to overthrow it. And he says capitalism is the final stage before we enter a classless state. But there has to be re-education for that to happen. All right. Have a good weekend.